Nikhila, Gordon. Hello everyone, we are Nikhila, Gordon and Bob from 9E, and we are going to present on the living conditions and housing problems of underprivileged people in Hong Kong to raise awareness on this issue. Hong Kong's housing crisis has always been a problem. Hong Kong has extreme housing prices compared to other regions. In 2021, the average living space of a public rental housing in Hong Kong was 145 square feet per person, which is very low comparing to America's 526 square feet per person. In the same year, the proportion of households with living space under 60 square feet per person was 0.5% in Hong Kong. This means that more than 37,000 people in Hong Kong live in such a condition. The average living space for residents in Hong Kong living in subdivided flats is 48 square feet per person, which shockingly is 3 times less than a parking space. Although the living space in public housing is very low already, people have to wait a long time to get into it. The average waiting time for applicants for public housing is 5.9 years according to the Housing Authority, reaching a 22-year high. The waiting time for elderly applicants is very high as well, reaching 3.8 years. For the private housings, the average price of a flat in Hong Kong is 9.8 million Hong Kong dollars, highest among all the major cities in the world, according to the CBRE. The average price per square feet in Hong Kong is 15,500 Hong Kong dollars, also the highest among these cities. Due to the soaring prices, the housing in Hong Kong is very unaffordable. The average monthly income for workers in Hong Kong is $18,400 according to the government census conducted in 2020. This means an average worker in Hong Kong has to work for 44.4 years without using any expenses to buy an average private flat in Hong Kong worth 9.8 million Hong Kong dollars. The even more worrying fact is the average savings per month per person in Hong Kong is 6,600 Hong Kong dollars, according to a research. At this rate, this means that an average Hong Kong person has to save for 124 years in order to buy a flat costing 9.8 million Hong Kong dollars, which is much higher than the life expectancy in Hong Kong of 85.1 years. This means that buying a flat in Hong Kong becomes an impossible task for most people.
Although knowing the background of the housing crisis in Hong Kong is good, it's not enough. We must understand the causes behind this housing crisis. Well, first, one of the main causes of the housing crisis would be land shortage. Well, because Hong Kong is a small place, there's over 7 million people living in 1,106 square kilometers. This makes land shortage one of the main causes for the extremely illogically high land prices in Hong Kong. In order to understand this, we must first break it down into how there is little houses and a lot of people, which means there's low supply and high demand for houses. Therefore, the land is expensive due to a shortage of it, which leads to expensive apartments. Another cause for the high housing prices in Hong Kong would be mainland developers driving up the prices for land in Hong Kong. And this is mainly because the government controls most land in Hong Kong and they offer it to the developers by tender. And in 2017, a plot of residential land in Hong Kong was bought by 2 Chinese developers at 2.17 billion. This exceeds market valuations by almost 50%, which is extremely high in terms of land prices. And this increases the prices of the flats, apartments, or villas that is built on the land. And this reduces the accessibility of the residential buildings to underprivileged people, which is the topic we are exploring. And this means they will have to live in cage homes or subdivided flats where the price or rent is cheaper, but they get a lower quality of life, and maybe most of you have like gone to other projects which they talk about housing crisis. You can see how they're living in those cage homes, like their living conditions are extremely poor. Going back to the topic before when I was talking about the high housing prices, this means a low accessibility for apartments for underprivileged people, which is caused by high land prices. And mainly the high land prices is because the revenue from selling land is the largest source of income for the Hong Kong government. Since the taxes in HK are low compared to other countries, the tax rate in UK, the basic tax rate is 20%, and the same income tax rate is in Hong Kong is 10 to 17%, which is a huge decrease in taxes. So the land prices in Hong Kong is high because it is like the golden goose for the Hong Kong government to generate income. So, and well, because the land is originally sold at a high price, then the price becomes extremely high after developers build buildings on it. So, and once again, this causes a steep increase in housing prices, which will lead to less cheap housing available for underprivileged citizens of Hong Kong, which forces them to live in small apartments or subdivided flats, which equals a lower quality of life. Now, looking at why the government has done so little to lower the housing prices, there's actually a historical reason for this. And well, remember what I just said about how a large percentage of the government's revenue comes from highly priced land sales. This is because in 1997, Hong Kong authorities once established a target of building 85,000 apartments a year to increase the supply of houses in order to lower the housing price. But this caused a backlash because at the time, many people owned buildings and they saw it like a form of steady investment which can be resold later. But then because they lowered the price of housing, this caused the Asian financial crisis and a property price plunge. And eventually the government was forced to stop selling land and to liquidate its successful public housing program. And then the housing prices started to recover due to the surplus of demand and lack of supply. So the government at this time was unable to respond in time to these rapidly rising housing prices because it removed its land bank when liquidating its public housing program. Now let's take a look at some statistics. The average price of a flat in Hong Kong is 9.8 million Hong Kong dollars, and the average price per square feet is 1,500 Hong Kong dollars. And due to these extreme prices, many citizens wonder if it is truly worth it to spend such an astronomical sum on a small apartment. And due to the housing prices being too high and the wait for public housing being too long, underprivileged citizens of Hong Kong are forced to rent subdivided flats or cage homes to stay in, as they may not be able to buy or rent larger apartments. This problem is quite significant because they live in a crowded and unsanitary, confined space, and they usually share toilets and kitchens, which means they are living in extremely bad conditions.
In face of this very serious issue, how does the government send out initiatives and policies to improve the situation? Firstly, the government sent out 2 urban planning initiatives. It set in train highly focused measures which is specific to public rental housing and the home ownership scheme. This prevents fraud as it redresses the imbalance between supply and demand and also restores the confidence of the public in the property market. It also aimed to gradually redraw the government's role as property developers, as its bidding of public housing projects is assigned to tenders, which can offer cheaper and more quality housings. And it contracts different contractors who specializes in different situations. The flagship of these policies are the public rental housing and the home ownership scheme by the Hong Kong Housing Authority. The difference is that the PRH, public rental housing, offers subsidized rental housing, whereas the home ownership scheme, HOS, offers government-assisted home ownership. These two are both applicable to public housing units for families in need, which are defined as household income and assets in the lower 40%, and the limits are yearly updated. Schemes such as Harmonious Families Priority Schemes offers priority to PRH applicants with elderly family members, and the government maintains a computer-run application system of applicants, frozen periods restricting the secondary market for PHU, and requirement for case-by-case green firm certification to avoid fraud. Despite these efforts, the Hong Kong's housing situation still doesn't improve. So, how can we reference successful solutions elsewhere? Firstly, we can look at Singapore. It has new towns and satellite cities centered around public housing, which develops self-sustained productive communities. Instead of making urban areas denser, it expands the urban area. And Singapore also offers mandatory funds only available for retirement of public housing, which makes the citizens lose out if they don't use that public housing. Also, in Vienna, the government collaborates with the private sector in indirectly regulating the housing market to provide affordable housing. Rents are regulated by the city government so that none of the residents pay any more than 20 to 25% of their household income for housing. It also has initiative to develop brownfield sites into high-quality public housing. Lastly, in Helsinki, Finland, it cut costs by public housing by running its own constructive company. Before taking any actions, we need to first examine the obstacles in pursuing these policies to solve the housing issue. Firstly, the property sectors accounted for 14% of the GDP in 2021 of the Hong Kong. So any policies regarding the industry may have a drastic impact on the economic performance of the whole economy. And then there's the lack of will to change highland prices. As highland price in Hong Kong have its merits to almost all other groups that is not underprivileged. The government gains considerable revenue. The community have its world-class infrastructure. The upper class gains an environment conducive to profit-making, personal wealth generated by growing property price growth. And also, constructors favor building commercial or high-end residential, as it provides a higher profit margin on the same plot of land, which is more expensive. On the other hand, how does non-governmental organizations, NGOs, act against this issue? It can be categorized into two categories. Firstly, there's actions that have few impact on the actual housing situation of the underprivileged. For example, Habit for Humanity offers wall planning, fixing peeling ceilings, and house cleaning for the eligible. The eligible is too vague, and these privileges only apply to those who have a house. On the other hand, Impact HK provides 90 people annually with shelter, yet there are over 1,500 homeless in Hong Kong, with hundreds more made homeless each year due to circumstances such as unemployment. The other category was innovative yet not financially possible ideas. These include cheap housing solutions that is not intensive enough to justify its requirement to build on large and thus expensive plots of land.
We are going to investigate on different cultural perspectives of this issue. Firstly, old versus young. The old people may not be used to the current situation as the housing prices was much lower and acceptable when they were young, will cause them unwillingly accept the expensive prices. Younger people may be used to this issue as they grew up with the expensive housing prices, but may be disappointed at it as there's an irregular ratio between the salary and the housing price, and they are more outspoken than the older population. For urban versus rural, the people living in the urban areas feel more about this issue because the soaring housing prices and smaller flats in the urban areas of Hong Kong. For the people living in rural areas, they are less affected by the housing prices due to the cheaper rural land prices, so they will be less affected and outspoken in this issue.
About the different cultural perspectives involved in this housing crisis and how housing is unavailable to underprivileged citizens, there is the rich versus the poor, definitely, because, well, the rich will likely not show much concern for the matter, or they will show concern but do nothing because they often have their own houses. And the poor will be more likely to protest against the sky-high prices of housing, but they will lack the influence to change a lot of stuff. So they will be trapped in a never-ending cycle of absurdly high housing prices. And another cultural perspective would be homeowners versus non-homeowners. Homeowners will have probably somehow benefited from the skyrocketing housing prices, and, well, they already have a house, so they won't, unless they're extremely ambitious, they won't go for a second one. So they won't speak out on this issue normally. And for non-homeowners, they will sometimes speak out about the outrageous housing prices because they cannot afford for it, and this is usually the younger generation, which means they do not have a lot of income or they do not have many savings to buy a house. And this is one of the problems with the housing prices in Hong Kong, is that young people cannot afford it at all unless they have like a really, really good job. And there's actually lack of support for non-homeowners from the government, which includes underprivileged people. So this may cause like many to be unable to purchase their own houses, which means that there will be a high demand for cheap housing, which has little to no supply. And so underprivileged people will not be able to afford such housing, so they will have to resort to other alternatives, which are cage homes and subdivided flats, which would in turn lead to a lower quality of life.
So, what are the other different cultural perspectives? First, there are the educated and the less educated. While the educated may have different perspectives to analyze the housing market rationally and are more accepting to the current situation, the less educated are more trapped in the issue as visions are clouded by the anger arising from seeing visual disparities between them and the upper class. The educated thus will more likely to build long-term goals to be a homeowner via research, investments, and overall the natural higher salary to achieve mortgage requirements. And then there's the expats and the locals. Expats have higher mobility to live in different countries as they don't have the emotional and family ties that local have, and may use Hong Kong's higher salary to only build up savings for purchasing a cheaper house elsewhere, and have such not much impact and feeling on the issue. The locals may be hurt by the emotional and family ties in Hong Kong as they are more vulnerable to the rotating housing prices, diminishing their hopes to own houses or multiple houses for self-generated income via rent. Lastly, there's the old contract government workers and other jobs. The old contract workers get a free house, while the new contract government workers may feel that it's unfair.
Thank you for listening to our presentation.